The lights inside the MSNBC studio were almost blinding, bouncing off the polished desk and the glass panels behind the panelists. The air carried that unique tension only live television can produce. The knowledge that one misstep, one viral moment could dominate headlines by the time the segment was over. Millions of viewers tuned in, expecting a standard political debate on constitutional law. What they got instead was a generational showdown that electrified the internet. At the center of it all stood two dramatically different figures: Alan Dershowitz and Representative Jasmine Crockett. On one side was Alan Dershowitz, a man whose name alone carried weight in the legal world. Harvard Law Professor Emeritus, constitutional scholar, defense attorney, to some of the most infamous figures in modern history. Dershowitz wasn't just a guest, he was an institution. For decades, he had dominated classrooms, courtrooms, and TV studios with his quick wit and unrelenting intellectual bravado. His reputation as a formidable debater preceded him, and it wasn't unusual for networks to bring him in as the ultimate authority on thorny legal issues. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas, known for her fiery speeches, unapologetic authenticity, and unyielding advocacy for marginalized communities. She wasn't a constitutional scholar in the ivory tower sense. She was a former public defender and civil rights attorney who had spent years in real courtrooms fighting for those who couldn't afford power or influence. While many assumed she would be outmatched by Dershowitz's decades of experience, Crockett possessed something equally potent: the ability to cut through elitist rhetoric and speak directly to the people. The topic of the night seemed academic. At first, the role of constitutional interpretation in modern politics. The veteran host, Andrea Mitchell, framed the discussion around executive power, voting rights, and judicial overreach. But what unfolded over the next 20 minutes wasn't a dry legal debate. It was a cultural lightning strike. Dershowitz entered, the segment confident, even dismissive, certain his usual tactics of historical citations and professorial authority would dominate. What he didn't anticipate was that Crockett came prepared not only with facts, but with fire. She had done her homework, including digging up some of Dershowitz's past statements. And she wasn't intimidated by his credentials. What happened next would soon become the talk of the nation. A single exchange that went viral across TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube, racking up millions of views within hours. It wasn't just about legal theory. It was about two Americas colliding on live television. The old guard of legal elites versus the new wave of leaders who spoke truth to power. By the end of the segment, the internet would crown its winner, and Dershowitz would leave the studio, looking rattled. But to understand why the clash resonated so deeply, we need to examine the figures behind the moment and how this explosive debate came to be. To understand why this debate became such a viral sensation, you have to first understand who Alan Dershowitz is, and why his presence alone adds gravity to any televised clash. Dershowitz is not just a lawyer. He's a legal legend, one of the most famous constitutional attorneys in modern American history. For decades, he has been a household name in legal and academic circles, known as much for his sharp intellect as for his willingness to defend highly controversial figures. His career began in the 1960s, when he joined Harvard Law School as one of the youngest professors in its history. Students praised him as a brilliant educator who could take the most complex constitutional issues and break them down with surgical precision. But Dershowitz's influence extended far beyond the classroom. He became a go-to defense attorney for the rich and infamous. His client list reads like a true crime documentary. Klaus von Bülow, Mike Tyson, O.J. Simpson, Julian Assange, and even advising members of Donald Trump's legal team. Every case seemed to spark headlines, and Dershowitz thrived in the limelight. He built a reputation as a fierce defender of civil liberties and due process, arguing that everyone, no matter how disliked, deserves a strong defense. To his supporters, this made him a principled legal scholar. To his critics, however, it made him look like a lawyer for hire, willing to twist constitutional arguments to fit the needs of whichever controversial client he represented. This perception would become central to what unfolded in his debate with Jasmine Crockett. In recent years, Dershowitz has increasingly appeared on cable news to comment on constitutional crises, executive authority, and judicial overreach. He frequently leans on his vast knowledge of legal history, citing precedents from the Founding Fathers to modern Supreme Court rulings. His arguments are often technically sound, but have drawn backlash for seeming disconnected from the lived realities of ordinary Americans. When he defended Trump during impeachment proceedings, for example, critics accused him of providing intellectual cover for abuses of power. This is part of why Dershowitz commands such a polarizing presence. He carries decades of authority, but with it comes a sense of untouchable elitism, an assumption that his Ivy League credentials and legal experience give him the final word on constitutional matters. On panels and interviews, he often speaks with a patronizing tone toward opponents, especially those without his academic pedigree. Walking into the MSNBC studio that evening, Dershowitz likely felt this would be another familiar outing. A chance to deliver a professorial lecture, impress the audience with legal citations, and dominate the conversation. What he didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't coming to play defense. She had a different kind of authority, one rooted not in academia, but in lived experience and moral clarity. And that contrast would set the stage for one of the most talked-about moments in political media. To fully appreciate why this clash struck such a nerve nationwide, it's essential to understand who Jasmine Crockett is and why she commands such loyalty from her supporters. Unlike Alan Dershowitz, whose career was forged in Ivy League halls and high-profile courtrooms, Crockett's path to prominence began on the front lines of the justice system, fighting for people who often had no voice. Jasmine Crockett grew up witnessing the struggles of working-class communities. She saw firsthand how systemic inequality and political neglect impacted ordinary families. Instead of pursuing a lucrative corporate law career, she chose a different route, becoming a public defender in Texas. This was not glamorous work. It involved late nights, underfunded cases, and client society often ignored. But it gave her a deep understanding of how laws and policies affect people on a day-to-day basis. When you sit across from a young man facing an unjust sentence because he can't afford bail, constitutional theory stops being abstract. It becomes deeply personal. Her legal career didn't stop at defense work. Crockett eventually transitioned into civil rights law, where she represented victims of police misconduct and challenged discriminatory laws. She became known for her fiery courtroom presence and her ability to translate legal jargon into plain language juries could understand. This same skill would later make her a force in politics and media, a rare combination of legal precision and relatable communication. When Crockett ran for Congress, many political insiders underestimated her. They assumed she lacked the polish and connections of career politicians, but Crockett turned her outsider status into her greatest weapon. She ran on a platform centered around voting rights, criminal justice reform, and holding those in power accountable. Her speeches were blunt, impassioned, and often went viral online. For voters who felt abandoned by establishment politicians, she became a refreshing and authentic voice. In Washington, she has lived up to that reputation. Crockett doesn't shy away from confrontation. Whether she's challenging a billionaire in a hearing or calling out systemic racism on the House floor, she's built a reputation for being unapologetically direct. Her critics dismiss her as too aggressive, but her supporters argue that she speaks the truth others are too afraid to say. And crucially, she grounds her arguments not just in ideology, but in real-life stories of the communities she represents. This authenticity is what made her appearance on the MSNBC panel so significant. To many, she was the underdog, going toe-to-toe with one of the most renowned legal scholars in modern history. But Crockett wasn't intimidated. She knew that while Dershowitz might have decades of legal citations at his disposal, she had something equally powerful: moral authority and the ability to connect with ordinary Americans. And as the cameras started rolling that night, this underdog energy would turn the entire debate on its head. The MSNBC studio was buzzing with an energy that could almost be felt through the television screen. Andrea Mitchell, ever the calm veteran of political journalism, welcomed viewers and introduced the evening's topic: the state of democracy, voting rights, and constitutional interpretation. On its surface, it sounded like a routine panel segment, but what unfolded was anything but ordinary. Alan Dershowitz sat poised, his posture upright and confident, exuding the aura of someone who had spent decades commanding attention in courtrooms and lecture halls. When Andrea turned to him for his opening remarks, he spoke with the authority of a man who had long been accustomed to being the smartest voice in the room. He began with a sweeping historical overview, invoking James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and referencing legal precedents that traced back a century. His tone was polished, professorial, and deliberate, but it also carried an unmistakable air of condescension. The Constitution has survived crises far more severe than today's, Dershowitz declared. Our courts have always risen to the occasion to interpret the law fairly, without bias. Those who claim our democracy is in peril are engaging in political theater, not constitutional analysis. To an academic audience, his words might have been compelling, but Andrea sensed the need to shift the conversation to more practical ground and invited Jasmine Crockett to respond. This was the moment many underestimated her. Here she was, a first-term congresswoman, facing off against a legal titan. Surely, she would offer a polite, deferential counterpoint, or so Dershowitz likely assumed. Instead, Crockett leaned forward, adjusted her mic, and delivered her opening in a voice that was steady yet full of conviction. "Professor Dershowitz," she began, "with all due respect, you can quote Madison and Hamilton all night, but the communities I represent don't live in the 18th century. They live right now, under maps and laws designed to silence them." Nantward studio grew noticeably quieter as she continued. Crockett didn't rely on academic citations. She told stories. She spoke of neighborhoods in Texas that had been surgically carved up to weaken minority voting power. She cited constituents who stood in line for hours to cast a ballot while wealthier districts breezed through. Her words had weight because they came from lived experience, not theory. Dershowitz attempted to interject, raising his hand slightly and offering a polite but dismissive chuckle. "Congresswoman, with respect, the courts cannot fix every grievance in politics. That is Congress's role." Crockett didn't miss a beat. And what happens when those in power manipulate the system to make sure Congress never changes? That's not just a grievance, that's a crisis. Andrea Mitchell looked between them, realizing this wasn't going to be a dry academic panel. Sparks were already flying, and the audience, both in the studio and at home, could feel it. The viral showdown was only just beginning. As the discussion continued, Dershowitz's confidence evolved into something sharper, an unmistakable tone of superiority that set the stage for what was to come. His voice carried the cadence of a professor lecturing a first-year law student, not a sitting member of Congress. Every time Crockett challenged his points, Dershowitz would respond with a condescending smile and a slow shake of his head, as though she simply didn't understand the law's nuances. "Congresswoman, He said with a patronizing chuckle, "I appreciate your passion, but the Constitution is not about feelings. It's about principles. We cannot let emotional arguments override centuries of legal precedent." His tone implied that Crockett's lived experience was somehow less valid than his decades of academic theorizing. Andrea Mitchell attempted to moderate, but Dershowitz seized the floor again. He began reciting a string of Supreme Court cases from memory, tossing around phrases like stare decisis and judicial restraint, clearly aimed at demonstrating his intellectual dominance. For a moment, it felt less like a panel discussion and more like a lecture, one meant to put Crockett in her place. What Dershowitz seemed blind to was how his words landed with the broader audience. Viewers at home weren't impressed by legal jargon. They wanted clarity, empathy, and accountability. His dismissive tone toward Crockett wasn't just noticeable, it was grating. And in the studio, you could see some members of the audience shift uncomfortably at the way he talked over her. At one point, Crockett tried to bring up recent examples of voter suppression in her district. Dershowitz interrupted with a smirk. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, the courts don't exist to validate political talking points." It was a cutting remark and an overstep. He'd underestimated not only Crockett's intellect, but her ability to counterpunch with precision. This dynamic, an older, elite male legal scholar attempting to belittle a younger black congresswoman, carried symbolic weight that resonated far beyond the walls of the MSNBC studio. Dershowitz wasn't just debating policy, he was embodying a broader attitude that many Americans are tired of, the idea that power and prestige automatically equal authority, and that grassroots voices don't deserve the same respect as ivory. Tower academics. Crockett's body language made it clear she wasn't rattled. If anything, Dershowitz's arrogance was fueling her. She let him finish his long-winded explanations, waited for the perfect openings, and kept her composure. While Dershowitz talked down to her, she remained poised, a strategy that would pay off spectacularly in just a few minutes. The tension had now evolved into something far more compelling. Not just a debate of ideas, but a clash of attitudes. The more Dershowitz leaned on arrogance, the more the audience began rooting for Crockett. And she was about to deliver a counterattack so sharp it would ignite a firestorm online. Crockett waited patiently as Dershowitz wrapped up yet another extended monologue on constitutional theory, nodding as though she were taking notes. When Andrea Mitchell turned to her for a response, Crockett leaned forward with a calm smile. And that's when the energy in the room shifted. "Professor Dershowitz," she began, her voice steady and deliberate. "You've spent a lot of time talking about precedent and principles. But here's the thing. You only seem to invoke those principles when they serve your clients or your political allies. Let's not pretend otherwise." The studio went quiet. It wasn't a personal attack. It was a direct challenge. And Crockett came prepared. She referenced a 1998 case Dershowitz had publicly commented on. A case where he argued passionately for judicial intervention in protecting voting rights. "Back then," Crockett continued, "you said the courts must act to prevent disenfranchisement, even if it meant stepping into what some might call political territory. But now, when similar voter suppression tactics are being used, you claim it's all about staying out of politics. So which is it? Were you wrong then, or are you wrong now?" Dershowitz blinked. For a moment, his confident grin faltered. He tried to interject with a legal distinction, but Crockett didn't let him wiggle out. She leaned in slightly, her tone still calm but now carrying a sharper edge. "You can dress it up in Latin phrases and cite every case from Marbury versus Madison to Bush versus Gore, but the reality is simple. Your so-called constitutional principles seem to depend on who's signing the checks." The audience audibly reacted. A few gasps, a smattering of applause. Even Andrea Mitchell looked intrigued. It wasn't just what Crockett said. It was how she said it. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't playing to the cameras. She delivered her points with surgical precision, exposing a contradiction in Dershowitz's public record without resorting to theatrics. Dershowitz attempted a rebuttal, insisting that his views had always been consistent, but Crockett was ready with receipts. She quoted his own words from the late 90s and early 2000s, where he had written op-eds urging the judiciary to protect voting rights against manipulative practices. "You argued for an active court then," she said firmly. "Now you say the courts should stand aside. The only difference I see is which party is trying to suppress votes. The reaction online, which would explode later, started right there in the studio." Cameras caught a couple of audience members nodding vigorously, and within seconds, producers behind the scenes were already marking this exchange for highlight reels. What made Crockett's counterattack so powerful wasn't just that she caught Dershowitz contradicting himself. It was that she framed the debate around people's real lives. She connected legal theory to voter suppression, civil rights, and democracy itself. And with that, she seized control of the conversation. Dershowitz had underestimated her once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. After her initial strike, Crockett didn't let up. The studio audience sensed that something extraordinary was happening, and the cameras stayed tightly focused on her as she began dismantling Dershowitz's positions one by one with the precision of a seasoned litigator. "Let's talk specifics," Crockett said, holding up her notes. "You've defended gerrymandering as a necessary evil of politics, yet you've also claimed to champion equal representation. Those two ideas can't coexist. When you draw lines that split black and brown communities into 3 or 4 different districts, their votes lose power. That's not democracy, that's disenfranchisement." She pointed out case after case from her own state of Texas, where courts had ruled that maps were intentionally discriminatory. "And yet," she said firmly, "you stand here and argue that courts should avoid intervention. If the courts won't protect constitutional rights, then who will? Politicians benefiting from the very suppression they created." Dershowitz attempted to pivot, emphasizing executive privilege and the separation of powers, another area where he was known to dominate debates, but Crockett was already ahead of him. "Executive privilege has limits," she said. "You yourself argued during the Clinton era that no one is above the law. Now you say executive privilege shields presidents almost entirely from investigation. Which version of Alan Dershowitz should we believe? The one who said truth matters, or the one who cashes in on defending power at all costs?" The audience reacted again, a mix of murmurs and audible agreement. Dershowitz's usual strategy of leaning on legal jargon wasn't working. Crockett translated every legal concept into plain language. She described how voter suppression doesn't happen in a vacuum. It affects people's health care, their wages, their schools. "When you silence voters, you silence their needs," she said. "And you've built a career out of finding legal justifications for that silencing." Even Andrea Mitchell stepped back and allowed the exchange to unfold without interruption. Crockett, sensing she had the floor, began questioning Dershowitz directly like she was cross-examining him in a courtroom. "Do you deny that the maps in North Carolina and Texas were designed to dilute minority votes?" Dershowitz fumbled, trying to reframe the question in abstract legal terms. Crockett cut him off smoothly. "A yes or no will do, Professor." The pressure built with each exchange. Dershowitz's face flushed slightly, and his voice lost some of its trademark calm. Crockett wasn't disrespectful. She remained poised, but her relentless focus made it impossible for him to retreat into academic detachment. By the end of her systematic takedown, Dershowitz looked less like the untouchable legal titan and more like a man cornered by the truth. The clip of this moment, once shared online, would be played over and over as an example of what happens when lived experience and moral clarity confront intellectual posturing. Crockett had done what few dared to do: hold Alan Dershowitz accountable using his own words and principles. As the exchange reached a boiling point, viewers sensed they were about to witness the defining moment of the debate, the kind of line destined to explode across social media. Dershowitz tried to recover his footing with a familiar tactic, framing himself as the impartial defender of constitutional principles above all political considerations. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I have always stood for constitutional principles, regardless of which party it benefits. The law must be applied consistently, not based on passion or politics." For a brief second there was a pause. Crockett tilted her head slightly, a faint smile forming as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Then she delivered the line that would echo across the internet within minutes. "With all due respect, Professor, you don't have constitutional principles. You have constitutional positions for hire." The words landed like a thunderclap. The studio audience let out a collective gasp, followed by a ripple of applause. Something unusual for a cable news panel. Andrea Mitchell, ever the professional, raised her eyebrows but didn't intervene. She knew a historic TV moment was unfolding. Dershowitz blinked, visibly taken aback. "That's a serious accusation," he retorted, his voice tightening. "I've spent my career defending the Constitution." Crockett didn't miss a beat. "And yet, your defense seems to shift based on who's cutting the check. When you defended civil liberties for civil rights activists decades ago, you were celebrated. Now, when you defend presidents who attack voting rights and enable corruption, you expect the same credit. The Constitution isn't a brand you can rent out. It's supposed to belong to all of us." The audience erupted again, some clapping, others murmuring in disbelief at her candor. The clip, once uploaded to Twitter and TikTok, would rack up millions of views within hours. Hashtags like Launchker Constitution for Hire and Auschen Crockett Clapback began trending almost instantly after the broadcast aired. Dershowitz tried to respond, but his words stumbled over Crockett's unwavering composure. She didn't gloat or raise her voice. Her delivery was calm, almost surgical. That made the blow land even harder. It wasn't a soundbite crafted for virality. It was an unfiltered truth delivered at precisely the right moment. By now, even Andrea Mitchell looked slightly stunned, remarking, "That's quite a statement, Congresswoman," as she moved to wrap the segment. The damage, however, was done. Dershowitz's authority on that panel had been thoroughly dismantled, and Crockett's profile had just skyrocketed. The viral clapback wasn't just a sharp retort. It crystallized the entire debate into a single, unforgettable sentence. It symbolized the generational and ideological clash at play. Old guard, legal prestige, versus new wave political authenticity. And for millions watching online, there was no question who won. The moment Andrea Mitchell signed off, the studio was still buzzing. Even off-camera, producers and staff were whispering about what they'd just witnessed. But outside the MSNBC studio, the reaction was even more explosive. Within minutes of airing clips of Jasmine Crockett's now iconic line, "You don't have constitutional principles. You have constitutional positions for hire," flooded social media feeds. Twitter lit up first. Political commentators, law professors, and everyday viewers alike began sharing the clip with captions like, "Jasmine Crockett just bodied Alan Dershowitz on live TV and a masterclass in speaking truth to power." Hashtags like Yodge Crockett Clapback, Now Positions for Hire, and Oh MSNBC Live began trending simultaneously. Some users posted side-by-side videos comparing Dershowitz's statements, defending different political figures over the years, essentially proving Crockett's point that his principles shifted depending on the client. TikTok and Instagram Reels soon followed. Gen Z creators remixed the moment into reaction videos, memes, and even dance edits set to music. One viral TikTok showed Crockett delivering the line with animated captions, and the caption, "This is how you end an argument respectfully and effectively." Another video stitched Dershowitz's stunned reaction with the caption, "When you realize you picked the wrong opponent." Cable news picked up the story almost immediately. CNN ran a segment titled Crockett versus Dershowitz, the clapback heard around the web, while The View discussed the exchange the following morning. Conservative outlets covered it too, though with a different spin. Some framing Crockett as disrespectful, which only fueled more debate and engagement online. Ironically, even the criticism amplified the reach of her remarks. Legal scholars weighed in as well. Several high-profile constitutional law professors tweeted that Crockett's statement, while biting, raised a legitimate point about the commodification of legal opinions in high-profile political cases. Law students on Reddit joked that her line would be quoted in classroom discussions for years to come. Meanwhile, Dershowitz found himself in an unusual position. Trending online not for his own legal arguments, but for being on the receiving end of a viral takedown. He went on Fox News later that evening attempting to clarify his position, but the damage was done. The viral clip had already shaped the narrative, and in the court of public opinion, Crockett was the undisputed winner. Back in her home district, supporters flooded Crockett's campaign office with congratulatory messages. She gained tens of thousands of new followers overnight, and small dollar donations surged. What had started as just another panel appearance had turned into a cultural lightning rod. This wasn't just another cable news debate. It had become a moment symbolizing a larger shift, one where authenticity and moral clarity often resonate more than decades of elite credentials. And with millions still sharing and discussing the clip days later, it was clear the impact wasn't fading anytime soon. The viral exchange between Alan Dershowitz and Jasmine Crockett was more than just a cable news skirmish. It became emblematic of a broader cultural and political shift happening in America. For decades, figures like Dershowitz, Ivy League credentialed, media-savvy legal titans, dominated public debates. Their words carried weight largely because of their resumes and reputations. But this moment demonstrated that authority and authenticity now share the same stage, and often, authenticity wins. Crockett's clapback resonated far beyond her district or MSNBC's usual audience. It tapped into a growing frustration among Americans who feel that traditional power brokers and so-called experts often bend their principles depending on who's paying or who's in power. Her sharp rebuke distilled a sentiment that many have felt for years but lacked the platform to articulate, that too often legal and political systems prioritize privilege over principle. In the days following the panel, think pieces emerged exploring why her words struck such a chord. Some attributed it to generational dynamics, the clash between an older establishment figure and a younger, more diverse wave of leadership. Others pointed to the gender and racial dynamics at play. A black woman fearlessly challenging one of the most well-known white male legal scholars on live TV. While these factors undoubtedly added layers of meaning, at its core, the moment was about accountability. Crockett held Dershowitz to his own record and, in doing so, exposed how easily lofty constitutional rhetoric can be weaponized or commodified. The impact wasn't limited to social media buzz. Crockett's surge in visibility translated into tangible political capital. She was invited onto more national platforms to discuss voting rights, constitutional law, and the future of democracy. Her fundraising numbers soared, but more importantly, she inspired a new wave of young activists and law students who saw in her a blueprint for challenging entrenched authority. For Dershowitz, the episode sparked a different kind of reckoning. While his supporters defended him, the viral nature of Crockett's critique meant that his legacy was being publicly re-examined. It wasn't that his decades-long legal career disappeared overnight, but the moment highlighted how quickly narratives can shift in the age of social media. Being out-argued on live TV wasn't just a bad day at the office. It became a meme, a rallying cry, and a cultural marker. Ultimately, the Dershowitz-Crockett exchange captured a truth about modern discourse. Facts matter, but so does framing, moral clarity, and the ability to connect with people on a human level. Crockett's rise symbolizes a new era of political communication, where lived experience and fearless authenticity carry as much weight as prestigious credentials. As the clip continues to circulate, its impact is less about one debate and more about what it represents: a demand for accountability, transparency, and courage in public life. And in that sense, Crockett's viral moment wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about signaling that the next generation of leaders isn't waiting for permission to speak truth to power.